Let me just check one thing. Can everybody see me all right and hear me all right? Just want to make sure before I dive into all of this. All right, good. So while you're posing questions, I'm going to quickly run through some of the content that we discussed during the workshops. So this really comes from a book that Rob McLean and I wrote, which is called Scaling Impact, Innovation for the Public Good. That's Rob and that's me. And, we spent a lot of time working on this. And as luck would have it, pretty much as the book was published and we began to do a bit of a tour to talk about it and to bring the ideas to the public, we were hit with the COVID-19 pandemic. So in many ways, we were impacted by that and also had an opportunity to learn quite a lot about scaling as many organizations around the world were trying to change how they operated very quickly to address that. Now, this image comes from the cover of our book, and this is in Mozambique. The area here is a plantation. It's called Bananalandia, and it's extremely large. It's so large that it turned Mozambique from a net importer of bananas into a net exporter. And above that farm and all around the country are these smallholder farms called mashambas. And both of these are expressions of large-scale solutions to agriculture. And there's this bright line that divides the two. So two solutions that somehow managed to evolve on their own. And Rob and I were seeing examples of this all the time and asking ourselves, well, how in the world do you decide which of these two is better, or how much of each is better, and who decides? These questions about scale, what opportunities and possibilities we have, what the decision-making process is like, how you judge whether the scaling effort was good or bad. How do you make that determination? So as we looked around the world, we saw many examples of scaling that seemed to have these decisions built into it. And we weren't really satisfied when we asked people about how these decisions should be made and how they should be judged. And we certainly came across many examples that made us question how we were going about scaling in the world of development. So this is a picture that I got from Engineers Without Borders. And I don't know much about it except it's a village, and the village has wells. In fact, it has 1, 2, 3 wells. Each well was drilled by a different organization. Each organization had a mandate to scale, and they measured their scaling by how many wells they drilled. And so in this one village, 3 wells were drilled. And this village isn't any better off for having 3 wells, right? There wasn't a need for 3 wells. It was simply 3 organizations focusing on their mandate to scale, arriving at a solution that didn't actually scale the impact. It scaled the organizations, and they did that scaling with greater resources, but they weren't scaling the end product of that, which was the impact. So we want to try to avoid that and to understand how we could go wrong and how we could get it right. We spent time talking to innovators in the Global South. And that's became the content for our book, which has 4 principles, 5 case studies, and we think challenges people to adopt a new mindset. It's free, and I've put this link in the chat so you can go back and find it, along with other materials at IDRC's website. So RDRC has been very generous about making this information available to the public. You can find an article that we wrote earlier in the Stanford Social Innovation Review there. And there are other bits of research and work that has been published since then. This is not on the website, but this touches on something we'll talk about called dynamic evaluation, which is part of our work. It was mentioned in this article in Systematic Review about how do you think about scaling. It was reviewed recently in the American Journal of Evaluation quite nicely. There's something called the Scaling Exchange, which has 18 scaling fellows from around the world who are working on questions of what does it mean to scale. And they have a call to action. And you can go to the website there. This information you can find at the link that I gave you. And I think that's a wonderful place to get involved with concepts of scaling, how they're coming to play in development, and how we might transform them. So the book was recently translated into French, and in general has garnered a lot of attention. So that's been good. We've liked that. But we do find conversations about scaling quite difficult, and a lot of that has to do with terms. I think that we're a field. If we work in evaluation or if we work in development, these are fields that seem to be divided by a common terminology, not necessarily brought together. And Rob and I like to joke that scaling impact is easy to understand, except for the words scaling and impact. So briefly, I'm going to talk about what we mean by these terms. If you come from evaluation, if you've worked in development, you've probably learned about impacts in the context of a logic model or a log frame or something like this, where there are inputs, activities, outputs, outcomes, and then eventually impacts. Well, in this model, impacts are only some of the consequences of activities, right? Outputs and outcomes are also consequences, but we don't consider them when we use the word impacts. They're typically the most important consequences. They're usually the last to occur. And there's an implied counterfactual. And what I mean by that is in many logic models, the impacts will be framed as something like, the community will be healthier. Students will improve their academic success. But I don't know what they're improving it in comparison, what it's being compared to when they're improving or when a group is healthier. And that point of comparison is the counterfactual. And this is a term that is becoming quite confused in development because most people now seem to be interpreting the word counterfactual to mean having a control group or having a comparison group, when in fact that's not what the term means. The term means there's some point of reference that you're using that doesn't actually exist in the world, that you're saying what happened is different than that. And you have different ways of trying to estimate that or approximate that. Comparison groups, control groups are one way, but there are many, many other ways as well. But at the very least, what we want to know is when you say something is better or different, what is it better and different than? And most logic models don't tell us. Well, we want to use a slightly different definition that we think is more appropriate for understanding impact when you're scaling. We want to consider all the consequences, not just some of them. So we want to at least put on the table the fact that everything that's a consequence of our actions may matter. They may matter to someone. And because when we scale, we're oftentimes engaging in an activity that has very uncertain results, we don't want to push something aside without thinking about it too much, because there could be something that we didn't think is important is really quite wonderful. Or it could be something that we didn't think was important that turns out to be a problem. So we want to have at least on the table all the consequences, though of course we can't look at them. We'll have to go through a process to think about what we do. But let's consider all of them. And let's consider them at any level of importance, because what's important to me might not be important to you, and vice versa. So importance is attached to people. So we want to consider what is important to everyone who's involved, and not simply decide in advance if something is or is not important. We could look at them as occurring any time after the action, and we like to be explicit about what the counterfactual is. All right, so this is...
John,
yes.
just to quickly come in, someone mentioned that the voice is becoming low intermittently. Just want to check if it's a problem for others also, then we can try and fix it. Is
Okay,
everyone
great.
able to hear clearly? Okay, great. I think then it might be an internet issue for
Yeah,
us.
maybe John can be a little louder.
Oh, am I too soft?
Yeah, so yeah, now it's better.
Okay,
Yeah,
Sorry to interrupt. Please continue.
yeah.
that's fine. Okay, I'm glad that most of you can hear. And I think what I've tried to do in just a couple of minutes is really take a whole graduate level course on understanding impact and push it into a couple of slides. And there may be some questions. So let me just check in now to see if there are.
None so far. If anyone has any questions, you can type into the chat box, and John can take those up every time he takes a break in the presentation. But none so far. Yeah, there's one question, John, on when we're talking about impact, what is the time frame?
Well, I think the time frame has to be determined by the context and also the people who are affected or involved. I mean, the whole group of stakeholders, but in particular, the people who are affected. So it could be that some impacts you expect to manifest in the relatively short term, and others you think could take quite a long time to manifest. So I think you need to consider that time frame based on the context. If you're interested in conservation with forestry, it might be that some of the effects you're looking for are going to take decades. Here in California, we've had a tremendous number of wildfires and their efforts to try to reclaim that land more quickly. But that's going to take decades, generations for some of that land to come back. In other cases, you're looking at something that's taking place in schools. And there, your time frame may be much shorter. It could be a matter of months or a year or two. And those are very different contexts, and you should use the ones that make sense to you.
There's another question on the consequences bit, that how do we draw boundaries when we're talking about all consequences? And then there's one more, but we can take another time.
Yeah, I actually have quite a bit more I can say about drawing these boundaries. It's a process. It's not an easy process. Perhaps what I'll do is answer that by going into a little more detail in just a bit. Was there another question? So I'll get back to the one about...
Okay. There's one other question on how does this framing fit with what funders are thinking or looking for?
Well, that's a great question. And I think the answer is one of the reasons we wrote the book is to try and change the way funders are thinking about this. If you go back to the picture with the wells, I think that reflects some of probably the most problematic thinking that funders sometimes engage in. They look at one organization, they don't think about how those organizations are connected. They give them a clear mandate and funding. They set up metrics that make sense to them and are easy to collect. And you have 3 organizations that can report to their separate funders that they met their scaling goals. But meeting those scaling goals didn't bring about the kind of good that they were hoping. There was a lot of redundancy there. So the answer is sometimes it doesn't align with what funders are currently thinking. We're hoping we can shift that thinking a bit. Maybe you can help.
A related question, and maybe that could be a segue for your next part of the presentation, is around funders increasingly want rapid M&E process evals, etc. Then how does one navigate scaling conversations in such a scenario?
Yeah, because they want it done quickly and have answers fast and to spend as little money as possible. Yeah, well, we'd all like everything to be fast, easy, and inexpensive, right? Yeah, I mean, I often get questions like this, and the questions I think have 2 parts to them. One part is I'm being asked to do something that seems not perfectly rational given my circumstances. So one question is, what would be more rational? What would be a better thing for me to do? The other part of that question is I'm being asked to do something by people who have a lot more power than I have. And how do I tell them there's a better way to do this when there may be when I feel like there could be consequences to me that are not positive if I do that? The first part, I think, is hopefully something that we can help you with in the book by suggesting some ways of going about scaling that might be better than we're currently seeing. But a lot of that, I think, you probably have already because you're connected to the work and you're connected to communities and you have a sense as to what may make sense. So taking that, maybe adding some of the things we've talked about in the book that you can get from the resources that I pointed to, that may help with the first part. The second part is really difficult, and you have to look at on a case-by-case basis. But I think, this is just a perspective, that if you have a good plan and you go to a funder with a plan, it does a lot to change the power dynamic. A lot of that is often premised on funders believing that the groups they're giving money to don't have a clear plan in place or may not put one in place for scaling and evaluating the scaling that they're doing. So if you have a good plan, then some of their motivation to take charge is reduced. There are some things I can talk about that having to do with pathways to scale. You'll see that in our book. There's a whole section on what's called pathways to scale. I get questions like this a lot, and I wish I could simply say that there was some easy way to point to a best answer and that everyone would simply nod their head and agree with it. It's not quite that simple. All right. Any other questions I should worry about here?
Yeah, there's one other question around how does the framework apply to what are called wicked problems?
Well, I think wicked problems are, if you boil them down, they're problems that are stubborn. Many people have tried to solve them and they seem to not be solved easily. The reason that they're hard to solve, there are many different possible reasons why they're difficult to solve. One reason is that some problems can only be solved by solutions that are implemented at a certain level of scale. Sometimes problems are wicked because there simply isn't an understanding of how to solve the problem. A lot of what we suggest is that the problems that we face, whether they're wicked or not, require a high level of innovation. That is, it requires us to be able to do something that we haven't previously been able to do, or haven't been able to do that well. And innovation is what allows us to do that. And what many of you are doing, even though you may not think of it as innovation, is precisely that. You're trying to find new ways to do something that previously could not be done. Well, because we're searching for innovations, and because we have to change the scale at which we implement those innovations to make them effective, there's a lot of uncertainty. So we think that there's a stepwise process where you should be implementing something to the degree that you have some certainty that will bring about the results that you expect. And that means that evaluation and scaling, they happen at the same time, right? Like they reinforce each other. You don't simply evaluate something here and then scale it up to there because you got some information here. They have to work together. If you follow that approach and you're willing to either stop or go back and reconsider what you're doing if the results aren't what you expect, then you start to move yourself slowly towards a solution of wicked problems. And we're doing them in contexts that are constantly changing. So even if you had the perfect solution today, in a year's time, it may not be the solution anymore. So this incremental approach in which we are taking both evaluation and scaling and having them reinforce each other through a process, I think that's what gets you to develop effective innovations that will, to some degree, solve problems that we consider wicked. All right. Anything else?
No, there are no other questions at this point.
Okay. Yes, I wish I had very, very specific answers to questions like that. I could say, if you look at page 38, you'll see that, in 5 sentences, it's explained exactly how to solve a wicked problem. But unfortunately, we're left to have to discover that. And so what we're suggesting is a process of discovery. All right, so scaling. What is that all about? Well, very quickly, this is a term that gets used all the time. It typically gets used in conjunction with another word. And I'm going to give you one sense of what that means. These terms are used very inconsistently, so it's not as if my definition of these terms will be universally applied everywhere, but I think they're pretty common. So you probably hear people talking about scaling up, and if I use a simple metaphor of an apple tree, then scaling up is like growing the tree larger so you get more fruit. There's scaling out, which is like planting more trees. So if you have an organization, you could make it larger rather. That would be scaling it up. If you have an organization and then you start to implement a program in different sites in different cities, and that would be scaling out. There's what's known as scaling deep, which is about qualitatively different results. You're nurturing the tree so that the fruit is larger and more delicious. You can combine these. You can scale up and out. And there are many other variations too. There's what's known as emergent or transformational scaling, which is an attempt not just to take one tree and turn it into many trees, but to turn it into a forest, which has an entirely different property as a system. There's horizontal scaling, which would be doing many things that use the same approach, but give you slightly different results. So you can grow red apples, and you can also grow green apples and grow pears, and that's horizontal scaling. There's what's called same scaling, which is a decision to keep things just the way they are. And that's a valid decision you can make while scaling. There's also descaling, which would be a decision to do less or to stop altogether. And then there's something that we call not scaling. And I realize after we've written the book that what we did was use some North American slang that people around the world find confusing. What we mean by this is something that does not actually qualify as scaling. It's faux scaling or fake scaling. And what that looks like is, say, growing 2 trees that are larger but getting less fruit. Doing something that has the superficial qualities of scaling without the actual benefits of scaling. All right, so there are lots and lots of these, and we don't really have an opinion about one of them being better. Any and all are fine, except for the not scaling one. They're going to depend on your context and your purpose. You're going to pick one that makes sense. But all of these have to do with what we call operational scale. They describe how an organization acts differently. Oh, I'm going to grow my tree bigger. I'm going to grow more trees. But we want to act differently to make the impacts different. And this is a key idea that I'd like you to take away, that we act differently to make impacts different. And that's what scaling is. Sometimes acting differently means doing more, but oftentimes acting differently means doing better or doing in a new way. Now, examples of operational scale would be scaling organizations, or scaling innovations, or scaling staff, or scaling participants, scaling resources, scaling funding. All of those are about acting differently. But if we want to act differently to make impacts different, difference between means and ends. And we would like those who are undertaking scaling to focus on the ends, not the means. And the ends in our case are impact, which is why we called the book Scaling Impact. All right, so we're about 10 minutes into this. And I've covered 2 terms. And what I'm going to do now very quickly is go through the 4 principles in our book, just tell you what they are. And then we're going to see where we should go after that, based on questions and a few comments that we've had. Okay. There's a question there. Perhaps you could tell me what that was.
Yes, there's one question.
Okay.
Could you share any example of transformational scaling? I would like to know how human resources are managed and new networks are developed, because transformational scaling might require new actors, networks to develop the transformation. So any practical example?
Yeah. So the book has 5 case studies in it, which is a good place to start. I think that it can be a little difficult to define transformational scaling, but you can see it. I think a couple of the examples would count as that. And then there is that article by Osvaldo Feinstein in which he looks at one component of what we do, which we call dynamic evaluation, which I'll talk about, and how that may be well suited for transformational change. So there are a couple of places you could dig deeper and try to find some more nuanced, practical examples. The thing about transformational change is that often the way it's viewed is from a kind of systems perspective, that there is a rather complex system in which you're working, and you don't just want to use the system to get a result that you like. You want to create results that end up changing the system somehow. You're going to change the way the system functions. So that takes a lot of time and tinkering. It's unlikely that you're going to look at a complex system, understand it very well, and then point to the relatively small number of things that you can affect and have transformation happen. Usually people, when they're successful at transformational change, are doing that in a way where there's a lot of trial and error and a great deal of collaboration. There are multiple understandings of how the system works. And they have a sufficiently long period of time to work it out that they have some chance at arriving at a solution. That is a very difficult set of circumstances to find, which is one of the reasons why transformational change isn't something that we see happening continuously or frequently. This gets even harder if you have many parties seeking different kinds of transformational change in the same system. And this is happening more and more, especially around climate, where people are working in the same areas trying to create transformational change, but they're all different kinds of transformation. And sometimes those transformations are thought of as disruptions, that they're going to make things radically different quickly and in a surprising way for people. Multiple disruptions happening simultaneously is another very difficult thing to try to navigate. But looking for practical examples, I think take a look at the case studies. Look at Osvaldo Feinstein's article. I think it's a little difficult for me to kind of dive into the details of something like that in this format. You're welcome. I wish I had, again, these are the sort of questions that are fantastic. I wish I had very, very succinct and short answers that were always correct. Yeah. Maybe I need a whole course on this where we can dive into case studies and really unpack them. All right, let's look at the 4 principles really quickly. There are 4 of them. They're not that complicated, but some of them may be a little different than you might anticipate. So the very first principle is justification. And the idea here is that scaling is a choice. There's something that we call the scaling imperative, that organizations, as oftentimes through their funders, but not always, feel that they must scale. Scaling is what success is. No matter what it is you're doing, you are trying to scale it. But scaling is a choice. You can scale or not. And if you scale, you can scale in many different ways. And in all the different ways that you scale, you could change impacts in many, many different ways. So you'd like to make a choice that makes impacts change in ways that you think are the best. Sometimes that means not scaling. Sometimes that means scaling rapidly. But it really is a choice, and it depends. And that choice should be shared. It should be shared not just among those who are working in an organization doing the scaling, not just among funders. Importantly, it should be shared with those who are affected. They're the experts in what a better life means. So they need to be involved in what we're doing. And those choices should be based on evidence and values. So not just evidence, because evidence tells us what we can do. Values help us understand what we should do. And importantly, this value should be coming, in part at least, but definitely coming from those who are affected. So the whole purpose of the first principle is to change the conversation away from starting with, how do we scale? Which is the first thing people ask, to should we scale? Is this something we should be doing? And if so, how should we scale? All right, principle 2 is optimal scale. More is not always better. Better is better, right? Sometimes more is better, sometimes it isn't. The fact that we connect more with better is really a legacy of the Industrial Revolution. It's a legacy of how we think about scaling in business and economics. And there's a lot we can learn from that and a lot that's useful. But unlike the world of business, when trying to create change that makes the lives of people better and the world more inhabitable, there isn't as tightly a link between more and better. I don't have to sell more things to make more money. To make people's lives better, sometimes what I need to change is something that's qualitative in the world, and that may be something small. That small qualitative change may be what I need. So sometimes more is better, but not always. And rather than thinking about quantities, let's think about impacts more holistically. We use 4 dimensions. Magnitude is 1, how many, how much, but also variety, which impacts are we creating? Equity, how are different groups affected by the impacts? And sustainability, how long do the impacts last, and how do the impacts contribute to a more robust natural world? You can use other dimensions if you want. These are just the 4 that we suggest. You could connect these to any other kind of criteria that you see, the DAC criteria or others. The point is that impacts have qualitative characteristics, and when we change them, we might want to be changing aspects, characteristics that have nothing to do with magnitude. The third principle is coordination. We're working in these complex systems, and we're unlikely to solve those problems just on our own. So we'll probably need an evolving set of actors with whom we have to coordinate this work. We don't want to end up like those organizations that are drilling the wells and doing that in an uncoordinated fashion. We'd like to work together so that we can create better impact. And since we're moving into the unknown when we scale, we need a flexible scaling process. We're unlikely to plan this all out at the beginning and follow that plan without change. Finally, dynamic evaluation. How do we know that we're scaling well? Well, we want to think of scaling as an intervention. So the sentence scaling is an intervention may seem a little strange because we often talk about scaling an intervention. But scaling is an intervention because we undertake scaling to change impacts. Now, here's what makes evaluating scaling quite difficult. Scaling creates dynamic change. And what I mean by that is scaling can actually change the way a system works. And the way that system works can change the way impacts are created. So this is push and pull between the system in which we're scaling and the impacts that we're creating. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that scaling is designed to have quite substantial effects. And it's hard to believe that if we're successful having substantial effect, that the system in which we're working will remain exactly the same. And the rules that governed how impacts were created at the beginning would be the same rules after we've scaled successfully. So we have to really be keeping an eye on that. And this is something I can dive into more deeply. But the really important bit, which I've already mentioned, is you need to undertake this evaluation before, during, and after scaling. You can't just think about doing it afterwards. It's a process that has to move together. All right, that is as much of a review as I'm going to do. I hope that I've at least given you some reminders of what we talked about when we were in person, or maybe tempted you to read more about this in the book and to dig deeper with the resources that I pointed you to. Maybe this is just like a 90-minute infomercial for reading more. I don't know. But now I would really like to try and move towards digging deeper in areas that are meaningful to those of you who are in this workshop, and also answer questions from those who attended the earlier workshops. Are there any questions?
None in the chat box so far. Let's
Okay.
give it a couple of minutes.
Okay.
But just to say that I think I had my notes from the last workshop in front of me. So this was a great refresher of what we learned in that workshop. Thank you for this.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm increasingly forced to summarize, it seems. From a book to a day, from a day to 90 minutes. Maybe I can get it down to one sentence. We'll see. So let's talk a little bit about this idea that we're interested in all impacts. I know that it seems a little crazy to say that we're interested in all impacts. And I know it can be frightening. Like, oh my gosh, I have to somehow measure all of these. But one of the things that we argue in the book is that organizations are responsible for all the impacts they create. Right? We don't just get to choose one or two that are convenient to measure or that we think are particularly good or important. And given that, it makes sense to spend some time reflecting on all the impacts that we might be creating so that you can develop a plan that is prioritized and targeted and strategic. So in the book, we talk about this under something that we refer to as a collection of impacts, and also the DIA model, which stands for desired, intended, and anticipated. And the seeds of this model really came from something that was published a long time ago. And I would not recommend reading this book, not because it's not fascinating, but I don't know, it's like 500 pages, and there's about one page where they mention something that's really the seed of the idea that I'm going to talk about here. But it's good to remind ourselves that we've been wrestling with these problems for a long time. So let's consider all of the possible impacts that we could have. And this box represents all of them. And I'm going to use these dots to represent a particular kind of impact. So each one in that is, they could be related to well-being. Each of the dot in the upper right is an impact related to well-being. We could have impacts related to income, and we could have impacts related to education and health, and so on and so forth. But just to illustrate the point, we can think about a universe of all the possible impacts that we could create. And if you are a normal, well-adjusted, sane person, you'll think, I don't know what they all are. How can I measure them all? This seems like an impossible thing that you're asking me to consider. Well, some of those, you're correct, you can anticipate. And other ones, you can't. Are you there?
Yeah, we are here. Sorry, I think we lost you for a few seconds.
Oh, did you? Yes, something happened. I don't know what it is. So let me see if I can change something on my side here. Hold on a second.
Sure.
I can no longer see you. Huh. I don't know what happened. There we go. All right, so you can hear and see me, right?
Hear you,
correct?
yes. We're seeing the presentation currently.
Fantastic. Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah, I don't know. Something happened on this end. All right. So you can anticipate some of those impacts, but not all of them. Now, the things that you can't anticipate are a bit of a problem, right? Because you can't consider them. So the solution here is that you should work with other people, right? If you bring together people who have expertise, bring together people who are affected, bring together people who have some insight, even bring together some of the people who are your critics, then collectively, you're going to anticipate more of those impacts. So one strategy for addressing all the impacts is to work with lots of people to anticipate what they are. And the more people you work with, the more you'll anticipate. And among those that are anticipated, what you're going to find is that some of them are desirable and some of them are undesirable. Not every impact that you could create is something that you want to try to create. It could be something that is negative. And as you work with lots of people, what you're going to find is that they aren't going to agree on what is desirable and what is undesirable. That is information. The fact that people have different perspectives is information. It's not a problem. It's an important thing to discover. So again, work with lots of people to understand for whom and in what ways are certain impacts desirable and which ones are undesirable. Among those that are desirable, some are going to be so important that they become your intended impacts. These are the things you focus on. Now, this is what we spend a lot of our time on, is those intended impacts there. And people are not going to agree on exactly what they should be either. But getting those different perspectives matter. Now, some undesirable impacts are going to be so undesirable that you're going to want to avoid them. And that these should be part of your intended impacts, that your intention is to avoid that undesirable thing. And people, again, are going to disagree on where you set the boundary there. So this gives us these four regions that we need to consider. They're the intended impacts, those that are anticipated and desirable, but maybe not so important that we need to focus all our attention on them. those that are anticipated and undesirable, but maybe not so important that we're going to focus all our attention on them. And then all those things we didn't anticipate. Most of what we do just focuses on part of the intended impacts, just the positive ones. But we have this region with all four of them. When we scale, we really don't know what's going to happen. There is something in each one of these four regions that may be of interest to us. And so we're left with the challenge of strategically allocating evaluation resources to all the impacts to these four places. With the intended impacts, we do many of the things that we're probably familiar with. With the ones in zone 2 and 3, we may want to come up with a strategy to look at some of them, because some things that we think are good but not that good may turn out to be great when we scale. And some of the things that we think could be bad but not so bad could be horrible. So we need a check on those. And then we need a way to search for all the unanticipated kinds of impacts. When we scale, especially when we're scaling innovations, there's so much we don't anticipate. And this, I think, becomes a point of discussion with funders. This can be something that you put into the proposal. It's like, here are the 4 zones. Here is how we have worked with other people to describe what goes into them. Here's how we have made choices about what to focus on as an intended impact. Here's how we're going to deploy our evaluation resources and monitoring resources to the other zones. And that, I think, is a way to address the idea that you're responsible for all the impacts while not losing your mind because there's an awful lot of them. All right. Hopefully that has helped answer the question that someone asked earlier. Or maybe I've just made created more questions for people. Well, someone says, Napani says, thank you so much. It definitely does. Hopefully it definitely does answer some questions. Not definitely does raise more questions. Maybe it does both. Okay. Topics you'd like me to address, questions that you have. I'm happy to keep kind of moving along. But our original plan was to try to be responsive to questions that people have. Can I give you an example of how?
Yeah, I can read that out for you if you want.
Sure.
Yeah, Avantika says, can you give us an example on how this was done for any recent evaluation?
Yeah, I can talk about one that I'm working on. I probably should leave some of the details out because I haven't talked to the people I'm working with about sharing it. It's probably enough to know that it's a program that supports girls in the Caribbean by providing scholarships and a set of sort of activities and psychosocial supports and health services. It really is attempting to be fairly comprehensive in the sorts of services it provides and the sorts of changes it would expect to see in girls, their families, and the community. So as you can imagine, the number of possible impacts there is quite huge. And they're in the process of moving from being relatively small to substantially larger, serving more girls, and also qualitatively changing the way that they work. The way that we've gone about addressing this is following more or less this model. Though I think, one of the things to think about in practice is that I don't necessarily talk to my clients about, here's a model, it has these pieces, it looks like this. But I'm using this to guide how our discussions work, and I am trying to fill these pieces in. And at the end, I may come to them and say, oh, here are the things we've talked about. These things look good. And what about the things we haven't talked about that we don't know about? So I'm using the model without necessarily approaching it as if I have to take all my clients to school and teach them the model. Right? The model is guiding our thinking. It's helping us, and it might be enough in this case for me to understand it and use it. So we spent a lot of time trying to list out what those impacts are. We started with the organization itself, which has a long history, their staff. We went to their extended staff. We went to the girls who are part of the program. We went to their families and community members. So we keep going out further and further and further to think about what kinds of impacts could be created, and talking about which ones are important, which ones aren't important, which ones are desirable, which ones aren't. And now we're at the process where we're trying to define that group that's intended. And once we get there, then we have the discussion about how to deploy the resources around these 4 bits. So I'm classifying them according to this, and I'll be bringing them to the client that way. But they're not actively working to try to put them into all these pieces. It just, our discussion evolves around this structure. Alternatively, I could bring them along and tell them, here's a structure, here's what we're going to use. It didn't seem like the most effective way here. So we have a large number of impacts that we're thinking about. And getting to the prioritization of which ones are the most important is really quite difficult. It's taking quite a number of rounds because the resources are limited. We can't look at everything all at once. I could provide more detail about that if you want.
I do have a follow-up question on that, actually.
Sure. Yeah.
If I can come in there, is when we are working with this framework as opposed to, say, a log model, is the development of change or identification of change pathways different? Yeah, I think that's a question. And then there's another question from Chella in the chat box that I can get to.
Okay. When you say identification of change, can you tell me what you mean by that?
The change pathways on, typically when you work with the POC, we also try to map out what leads to what, not necessarily always looking at causal pathways, but contributing pathways also. So does that look different in this framework?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because I think it points to a couple of things that are worth considering. So the first is, I think we as evaluators, as designers of programs, of people who are managing them and funding them, we do a better job when we can bring in many different ways of thinking about the same thing. So if I have multiple models in my head, multiple frameworks that I can apply, I'm going to understand what I'm looking at better. So this isn't competing with a logic model or a log frame. It's simply another way of looking at the same problem that tells me something different. Here, I get to look at many impacts, and I don't have to worry about the causal order that they're in or how they're related to each other. I just have to think about them as things that could happen. And once I've laid the boundaries out here, I can take this and put it into some kind of a logic model. I can say, oh, well, I have these two intended impacts. One has to do with girls being healthier, and another has to do with girls improving in their schoolwork. Okay. Well, how are they related to each other? Does being healthier make it more likely for you to do better in school so that there's a causal relationship that way? Is it the other way around? Do they interact with each other? Is there something else that's causing both of them? Right, so I can begin to play with those ideas once I have the pieces. Now, when we can also be looking at it at the same time, with log frames and logic models. There's a different kind of thinking that we're often asked to engage in when we look at those, where the structure is already there, and now we're trying to figure out which pieces go into which in that structure. That, I think, has the tendency to narrow our gaze very quickly. Right? I need an output, and then I need an outcome, and then I need some kind of impact. And once I've got those all together, okay, that's all I need to worry about. So looking at both of these together, here I'm looking very broadly and then narrowing it down. And then I can take those narrowed down bits and pieces and think about how they're connected to each other. I could go the other way around too. I could connect all the things together and then say, well, how does that fit into this? And what am I missing? But more than one model, I think, helps. It really helps us think more deeply, more completely. And we shouldn't think about these frameworks and models as competing, but as adding a different piece to the puzzle.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think is a great takeaway for me from this discussion. Getting to the next comment from Chella is he says normally one does not intend for the outcome to be undesirable or doesn't intend for the undesirable. Is it something forced by context? And
yeah, the intention here is to avoid what is undesirable. Right? So your intention is to create what is desirable and avoid things that are undesirable. And that is the intention bit. We shift the language there. But if you don't think of it as an intended impact, the intended impact is to avoid something. It's quite easy to lose track of this potential negative consequence and just never even notice that it happens because you're not looking over there. And that's what we want to avoid. We don't want that to happen. I mean, that's a real problem. We by defining only the good bits and focusing all of our attention on them, it's quite easy for us to miss the things that are undesirable. All right. Any other comments, directions, places you'd like me to go or not go? All right, well, I'm going to talk about something else. Let's see if I can. There we go. So in the book, we talk a lot about impact risk, and that is the risk that you don't create impacts that stakeholders think are desirable, or you create impacts that they think are undesirable. Right? That's the risk. The risk is you don't do the good things you set out to do, or you create some things that people don't like, even though you didn't want that to happen. When we're scaling, we are increasing our impact risk because we're doing something that we've never done before, right? We're operating at a scale we haven't operated at before, and we're not exactly sure what's going to happen. There's not this tight relationship between doing something 10 times as big and simply getting 10 times as many impacts that we got before. Those impacts could be different. We could be getting different kinds of impacts. We could find that it's much easier, much harder to get the impacts that we had before. So there's more impact risk. And whenever we're working with an innovation, there's more impact risk because by definition, an innovation is something that is new, we haven't used before. So let's just think about a kind of continuum where the impact risk goes from low to high. And that's what I've got going over here, from low to high. And then we can have another dimension, which is urgency, which also goes from low to high. So during the COVID pandemic, there was a high degree of urgency around finding a vaccine, right? That was an urgent problem. It wasn't just important. We had to do it fast. There are other problems that we're trying to solve where the urgency is lower. It doesn't mean they're less important. It simply means that we have a lower degree of urgency around finding the solution right now. So these are the dimensions I want to consider. How urgent is it that we create these impacts effectively? And what is our impact risk? Well, if we're over in this zone where the impact risk is low, the impact risk is high and the urgency is low, then we can use something which is described by some as a phased approach. And what we're trying to do is to scale what works. We spend time figuring out what works, and then we do it at a larger scale or a different kind of way. And then we figure out if it works at that scale, and then we do it at a larger scale. This kind of phased approach to scaling what works is what a lot of advocates of scaling suggest that we do. It looks a lot like what is done with most pharmaceuticals when the urgency is low. And you probably have heard quite a number of people suggest this, and it's oftentimes tightly linked to using RCTs and other kinds of evidence to determine what works. Let's say we're down here, though, where the urgency is low and the impact risk is low. Well, it makes sense to be using very rigorous forms of evidence when the impact risk is high. You really want to make sure you're accomplishing something. But when the impact risk is low, you can take another approach. And sometimes these approaches are called lean. You may hear people say, let the market decide. You see this a lot in business where somebody has a new idea for a product and they want to scale it up. And the best way to figure out whether it's a good idea is just put it in the market and see what happens. Now, if you are developing a vaccine, you probably don't just want to put it in the market and see what happens. It's not, right? You really want to believe that it's going to have the effects you want it to have. So it's pretty important not to confuse these two, right? For me, living in California and quite near Silicon Valley, this lean approach to scaling is very popular. And if you work in many traditional areas of development, then the phase scaling approach is probably very familiar. And they're viewed as if they should be universally applied, but clearly they shouldn't be, because confusing them and using them in the wrong context is going to be a problem. So let's put them back where they belong. What we want to do is to take this, you might call it a kind of generic approach to scaling, and fit it to the context that we have. When the urgency is high and the impact risk is low, then just go, just do it. There's no point in really waiting around. Speed is the key. But when you're up here, where the urgency is high and the impact risk is high, this is where you have crisis, and this is where principled innovation really matters. I think most of what we do is probably up in that quadrant, because there is some real urgency to finding solutions. And we would like to match this generic scaling strategy to the context. That's really my main point here. And to sort of avoid slogans and to match what we're doing with the reality on the ground. All right. That's yet one more framework. And one of the things you can do to get more detailed understanding of how these are applied is to look at the case studies in the book. One of the nice things about the case studies is they were written by other people, not by Rob and I. We were involved, but we didn't take charge of that. And the authors really considered where our ideas worked well and where they didn't work well in their particular context, which were relevant and which ideas were relevant and which ones weren't. So I think that gives you a much better sense as to how these ideas play out in practice. One other thing that I'm going to offer is that I know that some of you have wanted to talk more about particular projects you have or your work and how you're going about scaling, maybe how you're struggling with it or how you would like to plan it. So to help with that, I decided that I'm willing to offer some free office hours. So I'm willing for 6 people, up to 6 people, to have a free office hour to talk about their particular projects, where we can go into detail around what they're doing and see if there's something with the work that we've done that would inform that and help them. So if you're interested in that, you can contact Rajib, or you can contact me, either way. But yeah, I think as a big fan of COISA, I'm willing to volunteer a little time to its members and those who are affiliated with it to see if maybe I can provide some service to you in your efforts to scale.
Thank you, John. But John, before you close, there's a question you want to address. This question from Aki. The question is: I wonder at what timing shall we start thinking about scaling? When we design the project, do you consider scaling from the very beginning of the project, or after the project is finished? So does it depend on the result from the project? So
yeah,
if you just take this final question before you close, yeah.
Yes. So the short answer is you should be thinking about it from the beginning, right? The kind of thinking that's involved in scaling is more and more being brought into the beginning stages. People are asking, is this scalable? Can it scale? Even when it's very much a new idea. The longer answer is that Rob and I are proposing something which is called scaling science, which is really that there's a kind of science to how we go about scaling. Traditionally, there are kind of 2 parts to research and discovery and innovation. One is called discovery science. It's the beginning part. You're asking basic questions. Can I do this? What does that look like? Is this possible? And then there's what's known as implementation science, which is how do I bring this into the world? How do I How do I make it really useful to people? It's a rough distinction between the two. Where does one end, the other begin? It's a little unclear, but they're seen as sequential. And what we argue is scaling science, which is the science of how do we find and produce the optimal impact from this in a way that the people who are affected would endorse. Well, that really starts at the beginning and follows all the way through during discovery science and implementation science. So I think from the beginning, you're there. Yeah.
Great. So, any other questions from anyone? Otherwise, we can maybe it's now 1.5 hour session. We can close this session. But before that, any? No, great. So anyways, John, thank you so much for in November coming to India, taking those sessions, full day sessions in Delhi and Bangalore, and also the short session in Mumbai. And then definitely some of our participants, some of them actually could join the physical event in Delhi and Mumbai and Bangalore. So they asked us if you please organize a online session, virtual session sometime. And finally it happened today. So thank you so much, John, to come and take this very, very interesting session. And so I'm sure that people who joined the last 2 workshops or at least one of those workshops, it's just something new to ponder and to think and to work on actually. And very thank you so much also for offering free office hours for 6 of the our members. So if anybody is interested to talk to John, particularly on any project they are working on, I think John is available at least for 1 hour discussion. So you can write to me or John directly for a mutually convenient time and date, etc. So yeah, so thank you once again, and thanks all the participants. So hopefully we'll meet again sometime soon.
I hope so. Yes, I hope to come visit you again.
Excellent. Definitely, we would love to sponsor your trip also to India. I hope somebody like idea sponsors your trip. But thank you so much for offering to visit India again. So
Thank you, John. Thank you, John. It was great actually. So we must also see how we can kind of take it further. So we will always look for opportunities to interact either face to face or online, some way or the other.
Yeah. No, I would love to see you guys again, and I'm a fan of COISA, so any way I can support your work, I'm happy to do it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So thank you, John. Have a great day.
Okay, you too. Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you for attending, and I appreciate your interest and support.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.